Hi everyone, I'm Kate Kennedy and I'm here with day 51 of 100 Days of Kaine, PA. And we know that there's so many people who have had multiple generations of family live here in Kaine. And today we're going to talk to Rebecca Harris, who has 7 generations that have not only lived here in Kaine, but on the west side of Kaine. And she's going to tell the story of how her family came here, but also the story of why she and her husband recently returned to the west side and why she loves it so much. So I'm going to go ahead and flip you around and we're going to head into this beautiful home on the west side of Kaine. Hi, Rebecca, how are you?
Hi, I'm fine, Kate. Thank you for coming to visit us here.
Oh gosh, thank you so much for your time this morning, and I'm so excited to hear the stories that you have to share. Would you mind starting with how did your family come to Kaine?
Back shortly after the Civil War, the Rose family moved from out east. They were most recently in Snowshoe, Pennsylvania, where my great-great-grandfather worked as a lumberman and also as a railroad person. This was around the time that General Kaine was settling in the area, and there was a westward movement across Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania in this part actually was wilderness after much of the country had already been settled, but they were moving into this area, and everybody has seen pictures of what it looked like originally in Kaine with the little houses and so forth that were built from the native logs and trees here and the lumber. And that was what brought our family to Kaine. It was William Craig Rose. He was born in, around 1830, as a matter of fact, in the Philadelphia area. And he moved here as a Civil War veteran, came to the area, brought his wife Nancy with him, and eventually they had 9 children here on the west side. They moved to the West Kaine area and then to right around this area on Birch and Beach streets in the west side, where the family has lived now for so many generations, as you said.
Yes, and so they got here probably around like 1870s.
It would have been just around that time, I would say.
Shortly after the railroad came to Kaine.
Right, yes.
Shortly after it was established. Do you have any photos that you could kind of take us through to show us?
Oh, I absolutely do. I absolutely do. This picture is a family favorite, and this is a picture of William Craig in the center, the distinguished-looking white-haired gentleman who was a Civil War veteran. And next to him, to his left, that's William Franklin Rose, and that would be my great-grandfather.
So this is your great-great-grandfather.
That's right.
And this is your great-grandfather.
William Franklin Rose, yes. And it's rather an interesting story how we got doing family genealogy here, because this picture was taken on a day that the Civil War monument was dedicated at the Forest Lawn Cemetery. And a few years ago, the Historical Society had a picture of that event on their calendar. And as our son and my niece were looking at it, they recognized a person right in the very front row who they said looked like my brother Marty, like their Uncle Marty. And what we decided to do was dig out some family pictures and find out. And sure enough, we discovered that it was William Craig Rose, and that he, in fact, looked a great deal like my brother Marty. If you see, this is Marty over here. And he, too, at that point, had very white hair. And so that's sort of how our family interest in genealogy got going.
I think that's so fascinating that generations later, your kids, your son and niece could tell that there was a relationship based on the physical appearance. That's so cool.
It's quite strong. There are some actual other instances where there are people who look quite a bit like other members of the family too that we see. So that's part of the interest of it, I guess, and part of the joy. And the fact that we have ended up living on the west side here. We always said the west side's the best side. I went to the elementary school, which was West Side School, which is just across the street, across Beach Street from where we are right now. In fact, the corner where our house is where I stood as a 6th grade patrol and helped the children cross the street at that point. But it was very much the center, that school was, of what happened in this neighborhood. We all went to summer playground there. We had crafts and activities that we did. That was where our Girl Scouts met. That's where the PTO would be. The PTA is what it was called there. And of course, my mother was a member of the PTA, and all of us children, I'm the oldest of 6, and so all of us went to West Side School at some point, as my father had gone to school there, as my grandfather had gone to school there. And in fact, I have a picture from my grandfather that he painted in April of 1909, April 1st, 1909. And the inscription at the top is, "Now the days are filled with music, all the birds are back again." And he signed it Bernhard Rose, 4th grade.
How
1909.
special. That's really interesting. And so he made that picture at the West Side School when he was in 4th grade in 1909. And today, in 2019, you live across the street from that very spot where he made that.
That's right, yes. And that has made this house, that's one of the special things about this house, that it sits right at the center of so much that was part of our life growing up. Dennis and I had lived over on Pine Avenue, and we had a wonderful home there that we were very happy in, but it seemed like we wanted to downsize. And when we decided to look for houses, we were never expecting that we would come to a house that was the same size, basically, as the one that we had left, needed a tremendous amount of work to be done to it, and was not all on one story as the other one had been, but in fact was 2 or 3 stories high. And so it was exactly the opposite of what we were going to be looking for our retirement home. But this house is an illustration, I think, of one of the great reasons to be living in Kaine and why we live here on purpose, why we have chosen to. When we bought this house in 2008, it was in a very derelict condition. The neighbors would have liked to have seen it torn down, and there were parts of it that were condemned because unfortunately it had just been allowed to go into a terrible state of disrepair. But we were able to buy it at that point for a very, very low cost, which allowed us to put not only some of our cash reserves into it, but also a lot of sweat equity went into it too. Dennis is a wonderful craftsman when it comes to working on houses. And so basically the work that was done here in this house, he was able to do, and I learned how to do it. I learned how to use power tools during the time of this. But we have been able to create a beautiful home that is within 1 block of all of the homes that I have lived in my life, basically from when I was a young child. And to be able to come back here as a grown-up is just a real special gift. So,
what has that meant to you? What has that done for you or meant for you to be able to move back to this part of town after being away?
This feels like sacred space for us. When I look at my grandfather's picture that was done in 1909 when he was in the 4th grade, I think about when this house was built in 1918. Well, that would have been when my granddad was a teenager. And I can very easily imagine him as a teenager when they were building this house, they were digging out the foundation and hauling the wood around, and knowing how much he loved all of his life to do craftsman kinds of things. I am sure that my grandfather had a hand in doing something in this house, whether it was hauling water for the cement that they used for the foundation, or carrying wood when they were putting up the wood around the structure of the house and the framing of the house. I just feel like he was probably a part of that. And so that is very special, as well as the other generations that put down their roots here, raised their families, and actually lived a very good life in this community. They were always workers. They were always people who worked with the logging and lumbering, or they worked on the railroad, also in the glass factories. My grandfather was a glass cutter, and he continued to use that skill all of his life. Always, if we had a broken window, it was always my granddad who came and fixed it, because he still had his tools that he used for cutting. And so that was very special. It just feels like a sacred space. It's been a great place for raising our children in Kaine. When we were first married, we were living in Georgia, and then we moved to Chicago, and we would have loved to have stayed there, but frankly, the only thing we brought to Kaine with us when we moved, as we were joking about before, was our student debt. we had that was anchoring us at that point, but we were fortunate to come back to the town where my parents lived, right next door to where we moved in on Birch Street. And we had a lot of family support at that point too. It just felt like a good place to be. Although I have to admit that when I graduated from high school in the 1960s, in 1966, I never thought I would come back and live in my hometown again. That was not part of my dream at that point, but it just turned out to be the right place to be. Yeah. And our children going through the schools here, growing up, got off to a really good start. And you mentioned 7 generations. Our youngest grandchildren, who now live in Kaine also, will be the 6th generation of the Rose family to go through the Kaine area schools. And so that's something, I think that's
so
very
too.
special.
That is very special. And I just want to go back to what you were saying earlier about how the house was built in 1918.
Yes.
And that your grandfather was at Westside School in 1909, and that he would have walked these streets, walked right by it, maybe had a hand in it. How amazing. Like,
it is.
What a great visual. I got chills when you were saying that. I just wanted to acknowledge that, because I think that's really, really special, and that you can picture that and know that that was part of the history of this neighborhood and this home. I can see why you'd be drawn back.
Well, and I also reflect on the fact that ours is not the only family that has lived in Kaine for generations. If you go back into the censuses and look at the names, you'll recognize very many names of people who've been here for a long time. And in fact, there are people who have lived on the west side as well as we do, under pretty much the same circumstances. Our neighbor across the street lives in a house where he was born and has lived in all of his life and has raised his children there too. And there's another neighbor a block away that's very similar to that. And we, I guess, have chosen to be here because it just feels very much like home. We were talking earlier about the grocery stores in town. And that's part of what we remember. As I go for a walk, I go by the place where Micelis' store was, on the corner of Birch Street and Park Avenue, right across from Evergreen Park. And I remember going to my grandfather's house, which is just a half block up the way, and Grandpa would give us a dime, to me and my brother Marty, and we would walk the half block to Micelis' store and probably get a pop and maybe an ice cream cone or perhaps a candy bar, because everything cost a nickel at that point. And that was a great treat. I always got the cherry pop. I always liked that, or black cherry pop. That was great. But, and Popsicles in the summertime too, at Micelis. And that was a place where when we were old enough to walk the block all by ourselves, Mom would send us to the grocery store for a loaf of bread or a quart of milk or something. And in fact, there's a story that I remember very much about being old enough to go to the grocery store myself. I was walking 2 blocks then because we lived on the corner of Birch Street and Elk Avenue. And I had walked up the way to the grocery store, and I got probably a quart of milk and something else in the bag at Micelis, and I was walking down the way, and the bottom of the bag broke.
Oh no.
And the milk at that point would have been in a glass container, and it broke, and I was just devastated by what had happened. And I stood there. I was probably 8 years old or so. I was not very old. And I'm sure I probably stood there and cried and wondered what to do because I felt I'd done something wrong, that the bag had broken. And there was a very sweet man who came out of his house and helped me pick this up, and I think he actually gave me the money probably to go back to the store and buy another quart of milk. And he said to me, "Do you know who I am?" And I did know who he was. He was Uncle Charlie Bray, and he was actually my grandfather's uncle.
Oh, wow.
So he would have been my great uncle, and he was such a sweet man. Uncle Charlie and Aunt Ruth lived in the house that was right there on Birch Street, and they lived there pretty much all of their lives that I knew of. But they were part of the family in the neighborhood too. There were so many people that we were related to, both the Roses and the Brays, that I thought we were related to everybody in town. Actually, I thought everybody was a cousin because there were so many cousins that we had who lived here. My cousin Marilyn lived on the corner, and my cousin Billy. So Billy and Marilyn lived just up the street from where we were, and Uncle Charlie and Aunt Ruth were there. Ernie and Arlene Bray were there. They were also cousins. My cousin Gretchen and her brothers Tom and Dave lived here in town for a while. My grandparents, of course, were there. And it was just a delightful, cozy feeling kind of neighborhood. And when we moved back here to this house, I realized it was still that kind of a neighborhood. When we first moved in, there were quite a few young children who were in the neighborhood. And as we were working around the house, of course, they came around very curious to see what was going on. We had the doors and windows opened all the time in the summertime when we were working on the wood, and there was a lot of sound of pounding from the hammers and saws and so forth. And so the children came around, and I realized that it was still a neighborhood that was alive at that point. Now, those children, it's been 10 years ago since we bought this house, or 11 years now. And so those children are grown up, or they're in school, or high school or middle school at least now. And they're not young anymore, but there still is a wonderful sense of this neighborhood being very alive and active and so forth. So,
well, how special. These are great memories, great stories. And I just think it's really, really incredible to think about your family from the past walking down these same streets and the memories you must have when you go through the neighborhood. Is there anything else that you would want to share with us before we wrap up today?
Well, I think that for anyone, not just for people who have lived in Kaine all their lives, but people who are coming here, maybe returning, as many young people are returning right now, and older people as well, or people who are coming here for the first time. Whenever you come into a small community like this, there are very many special features and opportunities to take advantage of. Having lived in Chicago and having lived in larger cities, I can say that it's very possible to live next door to someone and not to know who the person is in the next apartment or the next house. And there's sometimes a sense of fear about who those strangers are. And I think in Kaine, people are not strangers for very long. That may be intrusive for some folks who are used to being not recognized or not noticed. But one thing that I can tell you is that when we lived in Chicago, I went to the same bank for 4 years, and they never knew who I was there. I always had to show ID before I could put money in or take money out of our account. When I came to Kaine, within weeks, everyone knew who I was. And I expected to come back here and be known as Becky Harris, who was the daughter of Marilyn and Norm Rose. I came back and I was suddenly known as Adam and Margaret's mother. Or I came back and I was also known as Dr. Harris' wife too. But these are connections. They're wonderful connections. Mm-hmm. And so I would say for anyone who is coming to a small community, take the opportunity to get to know what it's like and breathe in what is here. It's a great place to be. Mm-hmm. We couldn't imagine living anywhere else or raising our children anywhere else. And for every person who comes here, there's an opportunity to fit in, mm-hmm. to find your level of what you want to do or what you can do. A lot of opportunities for service, for caring for each other, great many spiritual opportunities in the community mm-hmm. with a variety of the churches and organizations and so forth that we have. So it's just a really blessed, special place to be.
I agree.
Very special.
I agree. So, great. Well, is there anything else?
No, I guess I would just say thank you to you for thank you for coming back to Kaine. Thank you for doing this, what you're doing with the chamber, and thank you as well for letting people know what the good things are about Kaine too. I appreciate that, Kate, very much.
Gosh, well, thank you so much, and I'm so grateful that you shared your story today. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed hearing the stories about the West Side and about many generations walking these same streets. I just think that's so incredible. And I know many of you have that same experience where you can picture your grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents walking in the streets of Kaine, as well as seeing your children or grandchildren walking those same streets. What a special thing about a small town. And I think it's also really interesting that this whole genealogy happened for this family based on a photo of a great-great-grandfather that looked like somebody in the family currently. And how cool is that we can identify each other sometimes just by saying, hey, you look like so-and-so. And again, a small town thing that doesn't happen everywhere. So thanks again for tuning in. I would love to hear from you guys and what your memories are of growing up and where you grew up. So feel free to comment below. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and we'll see you again tomorrow for day 52.